Hi, I'm Joe Graydon.
I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy, where we bring you the stories behind the health headlines.
This podcast is brought to you by Redix Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Body Cream. 800-345-7339, on the web at uttercream.com. Are you wondering if you should follow a gluten-free diet? What could it do for you? And are there any downsides? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Gluten is a protein that occurs naturally in wheat, rye, and barley. But for those with celiac disease, it poses a substantial threat. Dr. Peter Green is an internationally renowned expert on this condition.
People with celiac disease that's undiagnosed have an increased mortality which approaches twice that of the general population.
What is celiac disease and how would you get it diagnosed? Who else might benefit from a gluten-free diet?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, we talk with the authors of Gluten Exposed.
First, the news.
In the People's Pharmacy health headlines, now that it's almost fall, it's time to start thinking about flu shots. According to the American Academy of Pediatrics, all children older than 6 months of age should get shots this year. The nasal spray vaccine with a live attenuated flu virus was only about 3% effective last year, and the Academy discourages its use. Instead, this esteemed group of pediatricians recommends that children and their parents and caregivers receive injections with either 3 or 4 strains of inactivated influenza virus. Pregnant women and mothers who are breastfeeding also can and should be vaccinated, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics.
Asthma sufferers who take vitamin D supplements are less likely to experience severe asthma attacks. This conclusion comes from a new Cochrane review presented at the European Respiratory Society Congress this week. The investigators analyzed 7 trials, including children and 2 adults. Most of the patients continued to take their regular asthma medication during the 6 to 12 months of the studies. People who took oral vitamin D supplements instead of placebo reduced the rate of emergency department visits from 6% to 3%. Fewer people on vitamin D needed to treat their asthma with oral steroids. Vitamin D didn't help day-to-day symptoms, but it also didn't have troublesome side effects. Previous studies have suggested that people with low levels of vitamin D in their bodies are more susceptible to asthma exacerbations. However, it's not clear that all the benefits in these trials were due to correcting inadequate or deficient levels of the vitamin. The researchers stress that supplements are not a substitute for regular asthma control medication.
Chinese elders with low levels of vitamin D are more susceptible to mental decline than their peers with adequate levels of this nutrient. That was the conclusion from the Chinese Longitudinal Health Longevity Survey of more than 1,200 senior citizens. People who had low levels of vitamin D at the start of the study were twice as likely to have a significant drop in their cognitive test results. This sort of epidemiological data can't prove cause and effect, and it remains unclear whether taking vitamin D supplements would prevent cognitive decline. Nonetheless, it makes sense to monitor vitamin D levels and try to maintain them within normal limits.
People with elevated blood pressure are often encouraged to monitor it at home. That way they can tell how their blood pressure responds to a variety of conditions throughout the day. The electronic monitors have become sophisticated, easy to use, and portable. However, researchers have wondered about the accuracy of home blood pressure monitors. Italian scientists did a study of 721 hypertensive patients and found that wrist blood pressure monitors are less accurate than those that use a cuff higher on the arm. 620 of the people in the study had a significant discrepancy between blood pressure measurements. Part of the problem is that the wrist monitors require the wrist to be positioned at heart levels, and people often don't know about this or aren't able to do it. Failure to have the wrist at the correct position can lead to a falsely elevated reading and might result in people being treated unnecessarily.
Celiac disease is an autoimmune condition in which gluten triggers damage of the lining of the small intestine. Gluten, a protein found in barley, wheat, and rye, is found in bread, pretzels, pasta, pizza, and a host of other foods. In recent years, manufacturers have been producing and selling gluten-free alternatives to many of these foods. A study published in JAMA Internal Medicine found that the proportion of people diagnosed with celiac disease did not change significantly in the 5 years between 2009 and 2014. In those same years, however, the number of people following a gluten-free diet approximately tripled, from about 0.5% to 1.7% of the population studied. That study group was about 22,000 Americans in the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. Some of these people report they just feel better on a low-gluten diet. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Have you noticed a proliferation of gluten-free products in your supermarket? Perhaps you've heard a celebrity like tennis star Novak Djokovic talk about the benefits of a gluten-free diet and wondered if you should be avoiding gluten too. But what is gluten, and why would anyone avoid it?
To help us understand gluten, celiac disease, and the benefits and risks of a gluten-free diet, we turn to one of the country's foremost authorities. Dr. Peter Green is director of the Celiac Disease Center at Columbia University. He's the Ivan and Phyllis Seidenberg Professor of Medicine at the College of Physicians and Surgeons, Columbia University, and attending physician at the Columbia University Medical Center.
We're also speaking with Rory Jones. She's a medical writer and Dr. Green's co-author on 2 books. Their first was Celiac Disease, A Hidden Epidemic. Today we're focusing on the second, Gluten Exposed, the science behind the hype and how to navigate to a healthy, symptom-free life. Ms. Jones is an adjunct professor of narrative medicine at Barnard College at Columbia University.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Peter Green and Rory Jones.
Hello.
Nice to be here.
Dr. Green, the first time that we spoke to you on the People's Pharmacy many years ago, our listeners had barely heard about celiac disease. Most doctors thought it was unbelievably rare, and gluten-free food was almost impossible to find. Nowadays, gluten-free food is every place you turn around, and lots of people are following a gluten-free diet even though they don't have celiac disease. What happened?
Well, we're not quite sure why this has happened, but there is a tremendous increase in the use of the gluten-free diet. Firstly, as you mentioned, we have celiac disease. While there is increasing awareness of this, still the rate of underdiagnosis is extremely high. Probably the United States has the lowest rate of diagnosis. We know now that only 17% of those with celiac disease are actually diagnosed. So most people with the condition are not aware, and this is going on at the same time as a large proportion of the population on a gluten-free diet. And we don't really know why these people are avoiding gluten or wheat, but it's almost now an epidemic of the gluten-free diet as opposed to the previous epidemic of celiac disease, which is there, but people are not aware of it.
Well, let me turn to you, Rory. You were a person who had celiac disease, but it's my understanding that the diagnosis was delayed. Can you tell us a little bit about your story?
Sure. It turns out I was a banana baby. When I was very, very little, I appeared to be allergic to food. And one by one, they took me off of everything, and I was living on bananas. They reintroduced food. I was never diagnosed with celiac disease, but that's what I had. Go forward many, many years, and after I had my daughter, I became very sick. And it took many, many years until my blood work found its way into a random sample of in a study that Peter was doing, and came out tremendously high and tremendously positive. I had what they call silent celiac disease. I had no GI symptoms. I had peripheral neuropathies, and I had the skin manifestation, which is called dermatitis herpetiformis, with these blistering, itchy rashes all over my body. And when I went and met Peter for the endoscopy, he asked if he could biopsy what I was scratching on my hand. And it turned out that I had DH and I had celiac disease. But I was really, really sick for about 7 years before anybody was able to pin it down.
Dr. Green, how common is a situation like Ms. Jones?
It's very common in several ways. By far the majority of people now don't have gastrointestinal symptoms. They have other manifestations. And while it might have been silent celiac disease in Rory, it was not silent to her. She was having lots of issues, and it just wasn't put together. And that's one of the issues that we have, is physicians don't put it together. And she said she'd been ill for about 7 years. She's kind of lucky because the first study we did, the mean duration of symptoms prior to diagnosis was 11 years. So Rory was doing pretty good, all considering. Now the rate of the duration of symptoms has gone down, but still patients are very dissatisfied with their health care when they find that they have this disease, that they've had symptoms for a long time.
Now, did I hear you correctly, Dr. Green, when you said that only 17% of people with celiac disease are being correctly diagnosed?
That's right. You know, the prevalence in the population is about 0.7%. Amongst white people, it's 1.1%. But of that 1.1%, only 17% are aware that they have it. Now, if we accept that it's about 1% around the world, the highest rate of diagnosis is in Finland, where 70% of the 1% are diagnosed. And in Australia, 40% are diagnosed. So to have such a low rate of diagnosis is really quite pathetic, I think.
Well, maybe we should explain to our listeners what celiac disease is. Can you tell us?
Yes, celiac disease is this rather unique autoimmune condition in which people develop an immunological reaction to the protein in the cereal grains, wheat, rye, and barley. So gluten is the protein, and if you have celiac disease, you've developed an immune response that creates this inflammation in the bowel. And while the primary target is the bowel, it can affect any and all organs, from the teeth to the brain to the liver to the skin, as it did in Rory, and the bones. Because Rory also had osteoporosis. So she had dermatitis herpetiformis, she had osteoporosis, she had peripheral neuropathy, and these are common conditions. But physicians aren't associating them with celiac disease and testing for it appropriately.
Now, Rory, you said peripheral neuropathy, and a lot of our listeners may not understand what that manifests itself as. Can you describe that and any of the other symptoms that you had besides the itchy rash?
Sure. A peripheral neuropathy in my case was that tingling in my hands and in my feet, mainly in my hands and my arms. Some people think that it might come from the wrist. They feel that with all the use of typewriters, that was first written off by people by my doctor saying, well, if you're using the typewriter too much, it could make your fingers numb and tingly. I was always tired. I think that's the main ubiquitous symptom of fatigue. That what happens is when you're not digesting your food because the gluten is inflaming and destroying the lining of your small intestine, nothing goes right in your body. But the problem was that I didn't have GI symptoms, and celiac disease was considered a GI disorder. And I had migraines. I would get bad migraine headaches that just popped up again in that 7-year period. And there was no reason for them, that the doctors couldn't find anything wrong. And again, when the gluten-free diet, when I started it, the migraines went away, the peripheral neuropathies went away. That's not always the case. And it's possible that because I was able to absorb the food I was eating, I was getting the nutrition I needed so that my body could heal itself.
Now, Dr. Green, we've heard that undiagnosed anemia, that is to say people who have anemia but for no apparent cause, may sometimes also have celiac disease. Is that true?
Yes. About 15% of the people seen in the Celiac Center at Columbia University had presented with anemia. Overall, 30% of those with celiac disease have anemia, and most commonly it's iron deficiency anemia. And as most people know, anemia causes people to have fatigue, weakness, lethargy, increase the risk of neurological issues. So anemia is common. Now, once again, it's physicians putting it together. There are guidelines in this country and in the UK that everyone with iron deficiency anemia should be tested for celiac disease. We did a survey of hematologists, doctors that commonly see people with anemia, and it was only about 8% of them said that they would routinely test people with iron deficiency anemia for celiac disease. So that's just another example of the lack of physician awareness of the disease.
Now, we only have about a minute before the break. Can you tell us the consequences of undiagnosed celiac disease? What can go wrong?
People can feel miserable, fatigue, symptoms. There's an increased rate of associated autoimmunity, such as thyroid disease, arthritis, etc. And the worst prognosis is, of course, the development of lymphoma. Celiac disease can affect people at any age after you start eating gluten or wheat. So amongst children, the most common manifestations are growth issues, recurrent abdominal pain, and the development of other autoimmune conditions. So the picture in a child can be somewhat different to that in an adult. So the manifestations are great. Amongst adults, the great worry is the development of a lymphoma, as well as other malignancies. So it's not a disease that should be taken lightly. If you have the symptoms, you should have celiac disease diagnosed, should be treated right, which is a gluten-free diet, and it should be monitored properly.
You're listening to Dr. Peter Green, the Ivan and Phyllis Seidenberg Professor of Medicine at the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Columbia University. He directs Columbia University's Celiac Disease Center and is an attending physician at Columbia University Medical Center. We're also talking with Rory Jones. She's a medical writer and Dr. Green's co-author on 2 books. The first was Celiac Disease, A Hidden Epidemic. The second is Gluten Exposed, the science behind the hype and how to navigate to a healthy, symptom-free life.
After the break, we'll find out how doctors test for celiac disease.
Should you try a gluten-free diet before you see a doctor?
Is there any problem following a gluten-free diet if you don't have celiac disease?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
If you like the information you hear when you listen to The People's Pharmacy, you may also enjoy our book published by National Geographic. It's The People's Pharmacy Quick and Handy Home Remedies, available online at peoplespharmacy.com or at your favorite bookstore.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Red X Industries, makers of utterly smooth creams and lotions that deeply moisturize to make dry skin feel soft and smooth. The number's 800-345-7339. The website is uttercream.com.
If you would like to order a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. This is show number 1049. That number again, 800-732-2334, or or find it online at peoplespharmacy.com.
We're talking about celiac disease and a gluten-free diet. Should people without a diagnosis of celiac disease avoid pasta, pizza, and bread?
Our guest is Dr. Peter Green, the Ivan and Phyllis Seidenberg Professor of Medicine at the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Columbia University. He directs Columbia University's Celiac Disease Center.
Our other guest is Rory Jones, Adjunct Professor of Narrative Medicine at Barnard College. They're co-authors of the recent book, Gluten Exposed, The Science Behind the Hype and How to Navigate to a Healthy, Symptom-Free Life.
Dr. Green, you mentioned that people need to be tested for celiac disease if they have some of the symptoms that you have just mentioned. What does the testing entail?
Well, the testing entails, 1, going to the physician, 2, the physician doing a blood test. There are antibodies that have a very high sensitivity and specificity, which means that they're a good test. If the antibodies are positive, patients should be referred to a gastroenterologist for a biopsy of the small intestine. So there is a gold standard in diagnosis, and that's the biopsy. The blood tests that lead to the need for a biopsy are very good. Now, there's a tendency for people to just have the blood tests, but that's not really good enough because the blood tests are skewed to be positive rather than missing anyone. So the diagnosis has to be confirmed by a biopsy.
Now, I've heard a lot of people say, well, I think I may have celiac disease. I've just figured out I have a lot of these symptoms, so I'm going to stop eating gluten, and when I get around to it, maybe I'll see the doctor. Is that a good idea?
It's not a good idea, but it's actually very common, as you mentioned. And sometimes it's because patients aren't satisfied with the way the physicians have been working it out or not working it out. And they either go to the Google or they try an elimination diet and come upon the realization that it could be gluten that's causing their symptoms. So we know that when people change their diet, their symptoms can get better. And it's been shown that that is not a proof of celiac disease. So people should request the test for their doctor. And if their doctor says you can't have it or I don't think you have it, just be persistent and say, I would like the blood test. Because it's very hard to get diagnosed with celiac disease, which is an important disease. It's very hard if you've already started a gluten-free diet. We do offer a gluten challenge to some people if they're really interested in whether they have celiac disease.
Now, Dr. Green, you've mentioned the test, but you haven't actually named it. So please tell us, what is the name of the test so that people can ask their doctors?
The test is the antibody test. The most widely used and the most efficient test is an antibody to tissue transglutaminase, TTG test. It's a TTG IgA test, and it has a very high, greater than 90% sensitivity and specificity. That test is the gold standard. There are some people who have celiac disease without having this present, but by far the majority of people do have it. And the majority of people with a positive test have celiac disease, but you may get false positive tests.
Now, you mentioned how important the biopsy is, and we have heard that not all biopsies are created equal. That is to say, depending upon the skill of the gastroenterologist and where the biopsy is taken, sometimes it can be missed. Is that really true?
Yes, it is. So when these little biopsies are actually a square millimeter, and we have 22 feet of small intestine, and the disease is a patchy disorder. So you have to have an adequate number of pieces taken, which is 4 to 6. Most gastroenterologists take 2, so there has to be an adequate number of pieces, and they have to be taken in 2 separate areas of the intestine. So there's the variability in the disease, the variability in the gastroenterologist knowledge of that. And then when we get a biopsy done, it gets sent to the pathologist, and we're very dependent upon the pathologist's interpretation. And all pathologists are not created equally as well.
Now, Rory, I'd like to turn to your story, if I might. You were diagnosed with celiac disease. It took a long time, but not so long as to cause you too much trouble. My question is, have you completely eliminated gluten from your diet, and how hard has that been?
I have completely eliminated gluten from my life, as much as I am capable of, because we eat out, and there's always the potential for cross-contamination when you're eating out. But I aim for 100%, and then if I get a little bit of contamination, it may or may not be a problem. It hasn't been difficult for me because I was able to, I ate a more natural food, not natural, but a healthier food, regular food diet. I don't eat much processed food. And therefore, I didn't have that much gluten hidden in what I was eating. Different people find it difficult. I think a lot is about the person you take into the diagnosis and how you're told. So if you're the kind of person that says, my glass is always half full, as opposed to my glass is always half empty, it works much better. And there are people who go through life who are convinced they never got a glass. So, there is that kind of a thing. I cleaned out my kitchen cabinets. I worked with people in a support group who helped me. I learned how to shop. I learned how to read a label. And with all the gluten-free products that are now available, the pastas and the breads and the cakes, it's much, much easier.
Now, you mentioned processed food. Do people have to be especially careful about processed food? And where might gluten be hiding where we wouldn't expect it?
Right. Processed food is held together with the equivalent of food glue. All of the meats, even though there are manufacturers who have cold cuts and things like that, much processed food, even yogurt, is held together with it's food glue. It's a form of T-gas, as they call it, which is a form of transglutaminase, which is what it causes some of the problems in celiac disease. So you find a lot of problems in processed food because their wheat gluten is used to hold things together. The gluten is what holds bread together. Reading labels is not as hard anymore with the new labeling law. Wheat is one of the major allergens. It must be listed on labels. The biggest hidden problem is usually barley malt. You will find malt in a lot of different things because it's a sweetener. It's found in many different kinds of cereals, cakes, cookies, and it's usually listed as something other than barley. So that can be an issue. But I think if you learn how to read a label, and it's not that difficult, you find that in any number of books and websites how to do that, you can navigate your way around it. There are gluten-free labels now. One has to be somewhat careful there, and I think it's still important to read the ingredients.
So we've talked about celiac disease. We've found out what the test is and why it's important to be tested. Now I'd like to turn to the book that you guys have written. And it's a rather interesting concept because what we're talking about is gluten exposed. It has become almost a media frenzy, the disease du jour, and that is gluten sensitivity. And a lot of people, as you've already discussed, don't even bother to be tested. They just say, well, I must have celiac or I am gluten sensitive. I'm just going to eliminate gluten entirely from my diet or do the best I can. Why is that a problem, and why did you write Gluten Exposed? Dr. Peter Green.
There is this epidemic of people going on a gluten-free diet, and it's being done apparently for multiple reasons. It seems very attractive if you have any kind of issues to attribute it to something that you eat because you can change that. And it's as though a gluten-free diet has this medical legitimacy much more than any other diet because it's a prescribed diet. We prescribe it for celiac disease. And a lot of people have picked up on pseudoscience that many of our problems are due to gluten, that it causes inflammation, that it causes brain disease, that it causes many different disorders for which there's no scientific evidence for. So it's a trendy diet. It's the most Googled diet in the United States, and it's replaced all other diets, low carb, Atkins, South Beach diet. Now the major Google diet is gluten-free diet, and it's not really clear why that is. There are those reasons that I mentioned. But we don't think it's a very healthy diet because, wheat is a very nutritious grain, especially people who use whole grains. It's very good for your health. It's good for your cardiovascular state. But a gluten-free diet is not, because many of the gluten-free products that people consume are enriched with salt, fat, or sugar, because they're responsible for taste as well as gluten. So if you take one of those out, the others tend to be increased. So it's not a very nutritious diet, especially if you're using foods that are prepared. We're very worried about the heavy metal content, especially because the basic product using gluten-free foods is rice flour, and that tends to absorb the heavy metals, lead, mercury, arsenic, and cadmium. And there's evidence that people on a gluten-free diet have increased heavy metals. There's a bit of concern about corn mycotoxin in foods enriched with maize or corn. And it's a low-fiber diet. And many people who are on a restricted diet for gluten restrict other food products, and we don't think that's very healthy either. And that's because of the microbiome diversity is reduced in people who are on a restricted diet. So there appear to be multiple factors. One of the most important is the fact that rice flour is not fortified. And we actually see people on a gluten-free diet who are B vitamin deficient. B1, B2, B3, B6, folic acid. People can be deficient in these simply because they're not eating wheat flour.
Dr. Green, as I understand it, celiac disease patients who are under medical supervision may indeed be advised to take certain vitamins and possibly some minerals. People who are on their own unsupervised gluten-free diet might not know what vitamins or minerals they would need to supplement such a diet. Is that correct?
That's correct. If you're on a gluten-free diet and it's a very diverse diet, you might have adequate B vitamins. And we will routinely test people on a gluten-free diet for folic acid, vitamin B12, ferritin, which is a parameter of iron stores, and calcium and parathyroid hormone, both of which are manifestations of adequacy of calcium absorption. So all of those can be reduced. Other B vitamins as well. I've seen people with vitamin B6 deficiency who have very unusual neurological symptoms, all because of their strict gluten-free diet. So a gluten-containing normal diet is a very nutritious diet unless you need to avoid gluten.
Now, Dr. Green, you mentioned that some people who have adopted a gluten-free diet are also avoiding other foods. Tell us a little bit more about that and why that might be a problem.
It seems to be a phenomenon that is occurring with increasing frequently. Patients often identify gluten as being toxic to them and dairy. And then they may also add soy concerns and corn concerns. So there is a psychiatric condition called orthorexia nervosa, and in that condition, people progressively identify different foodstuffs as being toxic and withdraw them. So some of these people who have self-identified these different food classes and types may have a variant of orthorexia, or they may have symptoms related to their irritable bowel syndrome or something else that they're desperately trying to identify a food product because that'd be an easy fix. Like it's as if if I could only find the food that's causing my symptoms, I'd be better. And then you have the phenomenon of a placebo or nocebo effect, that when people change their diet, they have a beneficial effect that lasts for a period of time.
Rory, you have to avoid gluten or you will get very sick. And I'm guessing that you have to be very thoughtful about the nutrients that you add to make sure that you don't end up with a deficiency disease. I'm guessing that a lot of the complications of celiac are because people don't absorb those nutrients. What are you particularly careful about?
I would say that it's important to eat a variety of different foods, but I think that calcium is one of the top on my list. I don't have particularly good bones, but calcium is one of the harder nutrients, if you will, to make sure you're having enough of it. I'm very careful with the B vitamins, and I take a multivitamin pill. I take it probably 5 days a week, and I take vitamin D. That's also important for bones. I eat a very varied diet. I don't restrict anything but gluten. So I eat all types of fresh food, fish, meat, chickens, vegetables, fruits, and I try to stick to that. So that is an important way of doing that. But I would say that calcium and the B vitamins, and as long as I do eat meat, I'm getting enough iron, are the things I worry about the most. I think a lot of people, because they're worried about this, they read about it, they take vitamin pills, separate supplements. And I think this has become a multi-billion-dollar industry because people feel that whatever they're missing in their food supply, they'll pick up in a vitamin pill, which probably has fewer calories for people who are trying to be watching their weight. And vitamins and minerals are an unregulated industry that have their own problems. A lot of these pills contain gluten. And a lot of these pills contain none of the vitamin or mineral that's on the label or way, way too much of it. I think that Peter at the center, they've seen toxicity from people who are taking too much of a vitamin pill. So it's a balancing act.
You're listening to Rory Jones, Adjunct Professor of Narrative Medicine at Barnard College at Columbia University. We're also talking with Dr. Peter Green, the Ivan and Phyllis Seidenberg Professor of Medicine at the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Columbia University. He directs the university's Celiac Disease Center. They're co-authors of the new book, Gluten Exposed.
After the break, we'll learn about non-celiac gluten sensitivity.
Why is this condition so controversial?
And we'll learn about the myths and misconceptions that may be driving the popularity of gluten-free diets.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. If you value the health information you get when you listen to The People's Pharmacy, consider subscribing to our email newsletter. You'll get the latest health news and information on upcoming podcasts delivered to your inbox twice a week. Look for the link at peoplespharmacy.com. Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Redx Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Foot Cream with shea butter, helping dry, cracked feet feel utterly soft and smooth. The number is 800-345-7339. The website is uttercream.com.
If you'd like to purchase a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1049. That number again, 800-732-2334, or you can make the order online at peoplespharmacy.com.
Our topic today is gluten. Some people say they feel better when they follow a gluten-free diet. Recent research from Dr. Green's team suggests that there's a biological basis for non-celiac gluten sensitivity.
We're talking with Dr. Peter Green, the Ivan and Phyllis Seidenberg Professor of Medicine at the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Columbia University. He directs Columbia University's Celiac Disease Center and is an attending physician at Columbia University Medical Center. Our other guest, Rory Jones, is Dr. Green's co-author on their new book, Gluten Exposed. She's an adjunct professor of narrative medicine at Barnard College, Columbia University.
Dr. Peter Green, we've been talking a lot about celiac disease and gluten, and Rory, you have shared your personal story. I'd like to discuss a very controversial issue right now called non-celiac gluten sensitivity. What is it, and why is it so controversial?
The answer to the second question, why is it controversial, is that there's no specific test for the disorder. Okay, so what is non-celiac gluten sensitivity? So it's been described as the condition in which people appear to develop symptoms when they eat gluten or wheat mainly, and they disappear when they eat foods that don't contain it. It could be called non-celiac gluten sensitivity or non-celiac wheat sensitivity. Now, one of the problems is, apart from the fact that there's no specific test, is that when you study patients who have self-identified as being gluten sensitive, because typically it is a self-diagnosis now, it's very hard to reproduce symptoms when patients are given gluten versus a placebo in a controlled way. Only about max of 30% of people who have self-identified as being gluten sensitive are gluten sensitive when studied. So it is a very real condition. People can exhibit symptoms when they're gluten sensitive, but by far the majority of people who have self-identified is probably something else. One study from Australia put people on a low FODMAP diet, restricted all the things that cause gas and bloating, with this other trendy diet, the FODMAP diet. And when individuals who had self-identified as being gluten sensitive went on a low FODMAP diet, they could not perceive the fact that they were getting gluten versus placebo. So once again, it's typically a group of people that have irritable bowel syndrome symptoms that appear to resolve or not occur when they avoid gluten.
Dr. Green, you mentioned a low FODMAP diet. I wonder if you could explain that. What does that stand for, and why would it be a problem?
And please spell it.
I'll spell it, right? So it's FODMAP. And these are the initials of the different food products that cause gas and bloating. Poorly absorbed sugars mainly. Fructose is an example of a FODMAP. Fructans are in wheat, actually. And they're poorly digested, and they cause gas and bloating in individuals, typically with irritable bowel syndrome. So it is a trendy diet, but it can be very beneficial. One of the problems is that it is so restrictive, and it needs to be managed properly so that people can learn what parts of the FODMAPs they really need to avoid. Like we see people who need to avoid the beans and the legumes, people who need to avoid garlic and onions but tolerate broccoli, and because all of these products are on the low FODMAP diet.
Now, isn't this something people have kind of been doing for a long time? I know most of the people in my family don't eat onions and garlic because it causes them digestive distress.
That's right.
And so they just don't eat them, but they eat everything else.
They worked it out. So if they came along and they said that, I would mentally note and discuss it later, they have a variety of FODMAP sensitivity, but they've worked it out. Most people haven't worked it out, and they need help with working it out. So they're lucky. Irritable bowel syndrome is a whole hodgepodge of conditions. Most people with IBS report like symptoms after eating. And if we can identify what part of the FODMAPs, like your relatives, are sensitive to, then they restrict it and they feel great.
Rory, I've got a question for you about teenagers because, if you're a teenager, you want to be part of the group. You want to be able to get along and not stand out. And what do teenagers eat? Well, they eat a lot of pizza and other kinds of wheat products. And, of course, they're going to have pasta and this white stuff.
And pita bread.
Yeah, pita bread. I mean, all of that stuff that their buddies are eating. And, along comes somebody like maybe a parent or a doctor such as Dr. Green saying, I'm sorry, you've got celiac disease. You can't have any more white stuff in the form of, processed wheat. How do you help teenagers deal with celiac disease?
It's difficult. It depends, obviously, on the teenager. And if they're diagnosed in their teen years, it can be particularly difficult. Traditionally, the children who are diagnosed at a much younger age, by the time they're teenagers, have worked it out. It means working with them. Very often find that if they work with a nutritionist who understands the problem, that they have somebody other than a doctor or their mother or father that they can talk to and work things through with, that's very, very successful. If they work in a group with other children or other teens who have the same condition so that they can go together and get gluten-free pizza or learn to bring things, you have to teach them to be prepared, which is about the last thing that a teenager wants to be. They have to think about carrying some of their own food when they go out to a party, that they have their own gluten-free cakes to bring. It's a process, and I think that the parents have to help. The parents have to be taught also that they have to teach the child to be self-reliant, that they can't constantly be looking over their shoulder. They have to teach them how to ask questions in a restaurant and to feel confident in asking those questions and to advocate for themselves. It may take a fair amount of time, but most of the kids that you work with over a period of time become confident enough about themselves. Everybody's different, and everybody's different in a different way. And they simply have a simple problem with one foodstuff. And you explain to them it's not as if they have to take shots or do anything else to control their condition. And the bulk of them do quite well. There are lapses when they go off to college. There's a biggest problem when a lot of these kids leave home. But, as I said, it's a process.
Dr. Green, you talked a little earlier about something called the microbiome. And we've talked about this many times on the People's Pharmacy. I wonder if you could describe what that is, why it's important, especially when it comes to celiac disease, and tell us a little bit about the drugs that can affect the microbiome. The very popular class of drugs called proton pump inhibitors, the acid suppressors like Prilosec or Prevacid, and even some of the blood pressure medications. I don't think many people realize that drugs can impact the bugs in their belly.
So the microbiome, when I was in medical school, this was called normal flora, that we were aware that we have bacteria on our skin, in our mouth, through our gastrointestinal tract, and by far the bulk of our stool or feces are bacteria. And we evolved with these bugs. They train our immune system to recognize foreign proteins. We can't develop or survive without our bacteria. And there's increasing awareness now of the microbiome, and now it's being incriminated to cause alterations in the microbiome to cause most disease. And of course, celiac disease is involved with this, but it hasn't been fully worked out. But what's interesting is that the drugs that appear to increase the risk of getting celiac disease are ones that affect the microbiome. And the most prominent one of that is, of course, antibiotics. Antibiotics given in childhood. Thankfully, fewer kids are getting antibiotics, but they're very potent, and they can profoundly alter your gastrointestinal microbiome and that appears to be a risk for getting celiac disease. Proton pump inhibitors, the commonly prescribed acid-reducing drugs, also alter the microbiome, and coincidentally, they appear to be a risk factor for getting celiac disease. Gastrointestinal infections with rotavirus or Campylobacter increase the risk of getting celiac disease. So alterations of the microbiome are probably contributing to the development of celiac disease. But it's very, very complicated because our genetic makeup in turn contributes to the type of microbiome that we have. Living in our kind of society, we have a much less diverse microbiome compared to people living in the jungle of the Amazon that appear to have a more healthy microbiome. So it's a very complicated area, and it's certainly the phenomenon of the current decade, and it will come down to what its real role is over time. So the microbiome is important, incriminated in many diseases, including celiac disease, and can be altered by what you eat and the medications you take.
Is it well known that antibiotics or proton pump inhibitors can increase the risk of developing celiac disease?
It's well known among the celiac experts, so I don't know how well known it is amongst physicians out there. We're all kind of happy now that our kids aren't getting as many antibiotics, even though it's kind of reassuring when they do. It's not beneficial in the long run. So we hope that more people are becoming aware of the significance of these drugs and limiting their use.
Are there myths and misconceptions about gluten that are helping to drive this gluten-free craze? Rory?
I think the biggest misconception is that it's a great weight loss diet. It essentially, if you take all, as you mentioned before, white things out of your diet, which is the equivalent of the Atkins diet or the no-carb diet, you will lose weight. But once you start to add back a little bit of bread and a couple of pretzels and a piece of cake here and there, and then you go back to eating normally, you'll gain the weight back. And if you add gluten-free products, you will probably gain it back and then gain some because the products, as Peter said earlier, contain much higher levels of fat and sugar to hold them together and make them taste better. So I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions that you said earlier. This has been a media frenzy, and the media has basically said this is the stars and everyone coming out and saying that this is a great way to lose weight.
The misconception that I come across mostly is that gluten is toxic for people who don't have celiac disease, that gluten in some way causes inflammation, that gluten in some way causes autoimmunity, and there is no evidence for this at all. We don't have any evidence that gluten is toxic for people apart from those with celiac disease and those people who have a gluten sensitivity. There are people who are sensitive to gluten. We've recently done some studies that show that there are inflammatory markers that aren't the typical ones that we measure in those people who are truly gluten sensitive. But there is no evidence that gluten is bad for the brain or bad for the belly, as it has been suggested by 2 best-selling books.
In wrapping up our conversation today, Dr. Peter Green, I'd like you to tell us a little bit more about what happens when someone actually does have celiac disease and goes undiagnosed for 20, 30, or 40 years. What are the complications that people need to be aware of?
There are complications of the malabsorption of nutrients and complications of the chronic inflammation. The complications of the malabsorption are vitamin deficiencies, mineral deficiencies that may lead to neurological problems or osteoporosis or anemia. The complications of the inflammation the development of other autoimmune conditions, and the development of malignancies. People with celiac disease that's undiagnosed have an increased mortality which approaches twice that of the general population. And that increased mortality goes down to that of the general population after a period of time on the gluten-free diet. So just as low-dose aspirin is thought to be protective against getting colon polyps and dying of stroke, a gluten-free diet is protective for the development of malignancies in people with celiac disease.
Dr. Green, Ms. Jones, we'd like to thank you so much for writing Gluten Exposed and for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
It's been a pleasure being here.
It's been a great pleasure to be invited back to your show, so thank you very much.
You've been listening to Dr. Peter Green, Director of the Celiac Disease Center at Columbia University. He's the Ivan and Phyllis Seidenberg Professor of Medicine at the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Columbia University and attending physician at the Columbia University Medical Center. You'll find a link to his recently published research on non-celiac gluten sensitivity on our website.
He was joined in the Argo studio of New York by Rory Jones, Adjunct Professor of Narrative Medicine at Barnard College of Columbia University. They're co-authors of 2 books, Celiac Disease, A Hidden Epidemic, and their most recent, Gluten Exposed, The Science Behind the Hype and How to Navigate to a Healthy Symptom-Free Life.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wadarski and Dave Dripp are the engineers. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
If you would like to order a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1049. That number again, 800-732-2334, or place your order online at peoplespharmacy.com.
And when you visit our site, you can check out information on prescription drugs, herbal medicines, and home remedies. Share your own thoughts on today's show. We'd love to get your perspective. Have you tried a gluten-free diet? Please share your experiences.
At the website, you can sign up for our free online newsletter or the free podcast of our show. You can listen to it at your own convenience or share it with a friend. It's all there at peoplespharmacy.com.
In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to The People's Pharmacy.